All right, we shall begin. My name is Ruba Ali Al-Hassani. I'm a postdoctoral fellow with CPAD and University of Lancaster, and I'm very happy to be part of this panel, to be hosting it. So today we are discussing citizenship in the shadow of the state. And we have a wonderful panel here. I will introduce each, and then we can begin the presentations. So Saeed Ali Fatemi is a graduate student of social policy at the University of Tehran. His field of interest is focused on civic education, active citizenship, and education studies in general. And he recently published an article titled Citizenship and the Welfare State, Towards Active Citizenship Policy. Dr. Stacy Strobel is a professor of criminology and criminal justice at Shenandoah University in Virginia, USA, and is a fellow with CPAD, the University of Lancaster. Her research focuses on comparative criminal justice in the Arabian Gulf and Eastern Europe, with a particular attention paid to issues of gender, ethnicity, and religious identity. She's the author of Sectarian Order in Bahrain, The Social and Colonial Origins of Criminal Justice. Smadar Lavi, did I pronounce that right? Okay, just want to make sure I do. Smadar Lavi is a professor emerita of anthropology at UC Davis. She authored The Poetics of Military Occupation, receiving the honorable mention of the Victor Turner Award in co-edited Displacement, Diaspora, and Geographies of Identity. Her ethnography, Wrapped in the Flag of Israel, Mizrahi Single Mothers, and Bureaucratic Torture, received the honorable mention of the Association of Middle East Women's Studies. The book was finalist in the Clifford Geertz competition of the Society for the Anthropology of Religion. Lavi won the American Studies Association's 2009 Gloria Anzaldúa Prize in the Heart at East honor plaque for lifetime service to Mizrahi communities in Israel-Palestine. Miri Phillips is a PhD candidate in sociology at the University in Minnesota. Her research is concerned with the transnational politics, meaning, and remembrance of violence for religious minorities in the Middle East. Her dissertation looks at fragmented advocacy towards Middle East Christians in U.S. foreign policy. And we can go in order according to the program, unless there are any time urgencies. We can begin with Smadar. You have 15 minutes, and I can send you a message individually letting you know of any time restraints, 2 minutes before the time.
Okay, do you hear me well? Because I had speaker problems, microphone problems. Is it okay, the sound?
Yes.
Oh, fantastic. So my paper analyzes the historical support of Israel's majority citizenry, the Mizrahim, for the state ultranationalist right through the historic analysis of the relationship between the Zionist movement and Mizrahi women. The state of Israel's 50% citizen majority is the Mizrahim, or Jews with origins in the Arab and Muslim world and the margins of Ottoman Europe. The other two segments of Israel's citizenry are the 20% Palestinians with Israeli citizenship and the remaining 30% Ashkenazim, or European Jews of Yiddish-speaking origins. Ashkenazim control the division of power and privilege in the state. It might seem strange for an anthropologist to study the Mizrahi victims of state racism, who at the same time espouse right-wing chauvinistic ideologies and practices. Anthropologists tend to study subjects they are personally comfortable with, progressive and left-leaning. My work on the racial formations of Zionism reviews the reasons why Mizrahi women in Israel paradoxically support right-wing anti-Arab politics, even as they protest against the economic policies of the right-wing government and the state's intra-Jewish racism. The main reason the Mizrahim support the right is the foundational role of the Zionist left political parties that established and maintained the intra-Jewish racial formations of Zionism from 1882. The genesis of Zionism's racial formation was the 1882 importation of Yemeni natural workers to labor for the first wave of socialist Ashkenazi settlers in Palestine. This was the birth of the Ashkenazi Zionist left white privilege. Mizrahim share right-wing stance because they conceive the Zionist left regime as the historical perpetrator of their disenfranchisement. Other reasons stem from the Mizrahi sense of belonging to the Zionist state. This sense often results in Mizrahim setting themselves apart from those who share their phenotypes and regional heritage, but who are not Jewish, the Palestinians and citizens of neighboring Muslim states. In addition, these days, entire Mizrahi neighborhoods in the center of Israel are being gentrified and ethnically reconstituted because the Ashkenazi real estate bubble of central Israel continues to expand. Buying homes in pre-67 Israel has become completely unaffordable for most young Mizrahim. As the political center keeps moving to the extreme right, the West Bank settlements present one of the few options for newlyweds to become homeowners. The accelerating housing crisis has intensified the unchecked growth of the large urban West Bank settlements near the 1948 armistice line. Middle-aged, middle-class Mizrahim who gained equity in the real estate bubble of pre-67 Central Israel are selling their homes to Ashkenazim. Many parents of young Ashkenazi couples can no longer afford to help their children make a down payment for housing in upper middle-class enclaves in Israel's geographic center, so they are buying out the homes of the Mizrahi middle and lower middle classes. Mizrahi parents are dividing the cash from the sale of their pre-67 Central Israel home among their children. This is facilitating down payments for affordable housing in the settlements. The apartheid road system grants settlers a quick commute to pre-67 Israel, where most of their jobs are located. While intra-Jewish racial formations divide Mizrahim and Ashkenazim, the theological binary classification of the world as Jews versus Goyim, non-Jews, and in Hebrew colloquial it means enemies, recasts Mizrahim and Ashkenazim as the unified last line of defense for the Jewish homeland, Israel, an ethno-religious state formation perpetually at odds with its neighboring Arab Muslim majority states. Mizrahim are situated between their own economic cultural oppression and the Palestinian fight for national determination. With almost no privileges vis-à-vis the Ashkenazi elite, be it heads of Likud or the shrinking Labour Party, Mizrahim still have the privilege of being Jewish in a state where Judaism defines access to citizenship. If the Mizrahim changed loyalties in the Zionism versus Palestine equation, they would incur immediate losses to whatever gains they have made through the tenuous political economic upward mobility that accompanied their Ashkenazification. Unlike the majority of Mizrahi women, Mizrahi feminists are left-leaning, but they are not typical minority resistance movement. Mizrahim are a majoritarian group that cannot exercise majoritarian rights. The ruling Ashkenazi minority is racialized and disenfranchised Israel's demographic majority because their white privilege largely defines Israel's mainstream. Mizrahi feminists view Palestinian feminists as kissing ass, with well-funded Ashkenazi feminist NGOs who concentrate their activism around the long-term impact of Israel's 1967 occupation of the West Bank and Gaza on the Palestinians and on a hoped-for peace process. Palestinian feminists view Mizrahi feminists as right-wing Arab haters with no funding for joint projects. Nevertheless, no matter which Zionist left party has been in power, it has consistently carried out right-wing domestic social and economic policies. The Zionist left initiated Oslo in '93 peace economic that outsourced unskilled Mizrahi women's jobs to the Arab world or brought to Israel cheaper third world women to replace them. Even way before Oslo, this left has traditionally held a conservative economic view. Heavily influenced by the ideologies and methods of neocon guru Milton Friedman from '85 on, this left ushered Israel's privatization and deregulation that led to the disappearance of Israel's racialized Israeli version of the welfare state. The right wing simply followed in lockstep with the left. In addition, the only lasting peace agreement between Israel and its Arab neighbors was signed by the right-wing Likud head Menachem Begin in '78. Since 77, Mizrahim vote almost unanimously for the Likud, and more recently to Ashkenazi-headed ultranationalist parties, right of Likud. Moreover, it is during right-wing Israeli regimes that Mizrahi culture, as long as it avoids connecting its own Arabness with that of the Palestinians, is promised government funds and embarks on a renaissance. My aim in understanding Israel's normalization of the alt-right is to depart from the usual political perspective, the Israel-Palestine binary. I present a new analytical toolbox challenging the assumptions that the domestic socioeconomic politics of intra-Jewish racism and the international aspects of the Israel-Palestine conflict are two distinct domains. I argue that the plight of Israel's Mizrahim and the plight of Palestinians are complementary. The State of Israel uses war as a unifying force to divert attention from domestic issues of racial and gender justice through the sanctity of its Jewish citizens, portrayed as the chosen people in their biblical chosen land, mandatory Palestine. While Mizrahi feminists of color do stage protests against neoconservative restructuring in Israel, they cease when Israel undertakes a new cycle of violence against the Palestinians. They do not challenge their community's ultranationalism. As a result of the Jewish state unity against all goyim, Israel's demographic Jewish majority, racialized and minoritized, increasingly votes for neoconservative authoritarian politicians. The political center keeps moving further to the right. Now let me turn to ethnographic excerpts to illuminate my argument. This conversation occurred in Mitzpe Ramon, a tiny Mizrahi desert town perched upon a windswept plateau and overlooking a spectacular cirque. Isolated, Mitzpe has also one of the highest unemployment rates in Israel and is a hub of Mizrahi feminism. Our dialogue took place during Israel's 2006 war on Lebanon. Israel's defense minister was Moroccan Labour Party leader Amir Peretz. His election resulted in a large migration of traditional Ashkenazi labor voters, forming a new party mainly to avoid his leadership. His sister Flora was Mitzpe's mayor. One evening, Sigal turned to me and asked, "How goes the writing?" "Almost done, thank God for the quiet of the library and your generous hospitality. Anyway, what are you writing about?" "The history of Mizrahi women in Palestine during the Yishuv." Yishuv, or settlement in Hebrew, refers to the period of Ashkenazi settlement of Palestine between 1882 and 1948. It's for an encyclopedia on women in Muslim cultures. "Muslim cultures?" Another woman blurted out. "Do Muslims have culture?" "Why would they care about Jews?" asked another. "And why Palestine?" exclaimed a third. "It's Israel." "Why don't you read for us at the end of Tisha B'Av?" suggested Sigal. "We'll have a potluck and you can lecture." Tisha B'Av is the annual fast day commemorating the destruction of both the first and second temples in Jerusalem. It is a national holiday and a day of fasting. So on 3rd August 2006 at dusk, we gathered in the apartment of Luna, a Tunisian single mother of 4. Though she was fasting, she could not turn down the hotel's request to show up and work extra hours as so many Ashkenazim from Israel's north used the remoteness of Mitzpe's star-studded eco-resort to escape Hezbollah's bombardments from Lebanon. Luna was still dressed in her uniform along with the head cover that signified religious observance. A ceiling fan twirled above us and twin fans oscillated in the corners of the room, pushing dry hot air. Luna's balcony overlooked the wolf-tooth cliff at the cirque edge. Partially blocking the view were 2 frogs, Israel's hulking, green-painted cast iron dumpsters. As we waited for the sun to set so that we could break our fast, the skies altered mauve, orange, strawberry, red, then blurred into gray before blackening to night. In the twilight, sickle-horned Nubian ibexes loped elegantly towards the frogs to graze on the reeking trash. In all, 6 women sat in a circle to hear me read. Luna, Varda, Iris, Ortal, and my host Sigal were born in Israel to North African parents. None were originally from Mitzpe. They relocated following their ex-husbands who obtained blue-collar jobs in the IDF officer school nearby, the town's biggest employer. Iris was an unemployed remnant of an IDF uniform sewing plant. Ortal worked as a part-time cook in the officer's school. The sixth woman, Ludmila, was an Ashkenazi whose family fled Russia to Azerbaijan after World War II. Because she and her husband technically immigrated to Israel from an Asian republic, the Israeli authorities offered them housing in Mitzpeh instead of the center. She held a job at Mitzpeh's elementary school as an hourly data entrance worker. But the school is closed for the summer, so she was jobless. In front of these women, I trembled inside. It was one matter to write an academic book and have other scholars read and comment on it. It was another matter altogether to deliver a talk to real people huddled around you in a hot, stuffy room. These women were my small audience, and I wanted to keep things civil. How would these right-wing Likudniks accept my text? It went against the Ashkenazi Zionist credo drummed into their heads in school. I sure hope they didn't throw me in with the Ashkenazi left peacenik feminists and kick me out of town. Even if I kowtowed to them, could I handle the typical Israeli habit of interjecting an opinion, welcome or not? My text was in English. I had to translate on the fly. Even so, whenever possible, I relied on terms the women learned in school and carefully interjected new meanings to get my point across. Could I make it to the end? Nevertheless, with pauses and hesitations, I began to read. When I finished reading the Ewak entry, no one talked. Only the twirl of the fan blades. I felt the women's gaze on me. There were no pages to retreat behind. Unlike the scholars who would read the encyclopedia entry, my audience on this night was staring me in the face. As I translated the text to them, I skipped the portions that they already knew, such as information on the specifics about the kidnapping of Mizrahi babies sold for adoption. The women probably knew more about these than I did. The content that they didn't know so well and what the women thought of it was what caused me to tremble. Averting my eyes, I stared at the half moon knifing through the open balcony door, still anxious and without the post-performance glow. Throughout the talk, the women freely interjected Israel every time I mentioned Palestine. They sparked up arguments to protest or support points I raised, using examples from their own lives. To my surprise, my advocate was Ludmila. Let her talk, she shushed in her Slavic accented Hebrew. But now, silence. As Luna arrived from the kitchen, she muttered, I don't believe any of it. Can't be that bad. Ashkenazi Manas, we are all Jews with warm Jewish hearts. Going, the rest of them. Iris, louder. Yes, it's that bad. It's even worse. They planned it. They ran like clockwork. These Europeans, so cold and calculated. Ashkenazim. Ashkenazim is a bigoted Israeli slang combining Ashkenazim and Nazis. Iris pronounced it slowly, every syllable a hammerstroke. Troublemakers in Europe back then, troublemakers here, right now. How dare you? Don't touch my Shoah, exclaimed Ludmila. What chutzpah? Were your parents in the camps? She posed. Partisans? She needled. Silence again. Their model is not German. They're socialist, Bolshevik, Stalinist mentality, Ludmila hissed. I believe everything the professor said because it's just like the Soviet mind. Her books are published here, all in Hebrew. That's how you know that's the truth. Ludmila took another pause, suddenly aware of her gushing. The fans rumbled. Jews need to stop being victims. In the Middle East, it's a law of the jungle. All of us accept it. You don't. She turned to me and pointed. But that's nature. The Jews' right to survive in the jungle. When in war, act like it's war. Ortal. These Ashkenazi leftists raise their self-esteem, saying, I'm helping the weak. I love the Aravim. Aravim means Arabs in Hebrew. I'm generous. I'm wonderful. What an ego trip. But what about us? Why do they hate us? They hate us, all right, but advanced us, said Sigal. We're no longer Aravim. We no longer veil. No killing daughters for honor. Our men no longer marry several wives. Thank God we live in a Jewish state. So what if the Ashkenazim burst it? Iris, yes, they hate us because we vote Likud. Of course we vote for the right. They didn't do these crimes to us. It was Labour Party and the rest of them left. That's what she lectured about. The Zionist foundational narrative set the scene for the atrocities suffered by Mizrahi women from 1882 on, culminating in the kidnapping of their babies to be sold for adoption and unconsented medical experimentation. Today, disenfranchisement, poverty, Arab phenotype, Arabic accent, and Arab name discrimination are still integral to the lives of Mizrahi women. Likud screwed with us too, said Sigal, but we must support them. They are not wishy-washy with peace mumbo-jumbo. Look here, when the left is in power, there are wars with the Aravim, 48, 56, 67, 73, even now with Flora's brother, his labor. With Likud and the right, there's quiet. The Aravim are afraid to come out of their cubbyholes. The right doesn't talk peace. They're honest. When in war, act like it's war. After the talk, Sigal and I helped Luna gather her dishes from the table. When we walked back to her apartment, we chose a scenic route along the promenade on the edge of the cirque. We ambled, tired from the fast, the large meal, and the arguments. The lopsided moon's rays lit the craggy cliffs above the plateau, but left the cirque's searing depths in thick darkness. The crisp and cool desert breeze came from the north and caressed our southbound backs. Sigal and I said nothing to each other. The sustained silence between us implied neither a deep bond of friendship nor absolute strangerhood. Were we still sisters to the struggle? Did she and the others think I was one of those Ashkenazi leftists? Would they abandon Ahoti in our future projects? Would it be my fault? Without warning, Sigal blurted out, "Why do you speak in favor of the Aravim? It's over with. Do you really love them? When the time comes, they slaughter us. You won't get a pass because you call yourself an Arab Jew and think you are one of them. They are the enemy. God bless Mitzpeh, far away from the Qassam missiles in Gaza, let alone the Hezbollah Katyushas from Lebanon. You know, the missiles can reach Tel Aviv, where you and the Shishi sisters live, but Hamas and Hezbollah won't dare attack." She forced a chuckle. "Suicide bombers don't come to Mitzpeh," she continued, "too piddly. The media won't come this far to cover them. News has to be within an hour's drive, 2 hours max." She paused before answering. I didn't want to start an argument. After all, she was my host. I really don't know. I think we can't separate the Mizrahim from the Palestinians. Sure we can, she shot back. We are Jews. They are going. I'm done.
Thank you for your talk, Smadar. Next, we have Sayed Ali.
Hello.
And I will be messaging you individually to let you know about the time.
Okay, and do you have my voice?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, let me share the screen. And do you have my screen?
Yes, we can see it.
Okay. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity today to present my work on the relationship between national belonging and religious education in Iran. As you know, the world in recent decades has paid serious attention to the issue of civic education and training of citizens. For the reason, one can generally speak of the need for societies to cultivate civic virtues among citizens, especially the youth, in order to maintain social cohesion. However, the general term cultivating civic virtues and its implications for a national curriculum are vague. As Dewey puts it, the conception of education as a social process and function has no definite meaning until we define the kind of society we have in mind. This is where, in my opinion, citizenship education is essentially linked to the nature of a society and the image of a nation. Moreover, our discussion now is specifically about Iran, a country in which understanding the meaning of nationality has always been a contentious issue over the last century. I think some factors can be considered in explaining the problematic concept of nationality in Iran. To explain this problem, Miri speaks of three main pillars in Iranian identity: territorial borders of Iran, Persian language, and Shia religion. Each of these components has been emphasized in historical periods in contemporary Iran. Nevertheless, the influence of the element of religion in all the political relation of the last decade is obvious, and for this reason, I want to talk about this factor. First, a historical review. Towards the end of the Qajar period, Iranian intellectuals introduced the image of the homeland into public debate through their ideas. But in the end, it was the institution of religion that was responsible for much of the popular mobilization for the constitutional revolution. After the constitutional revolution, the most important challenge among revolutionaries arose over the duality of constitutionalism or Sharia. Moreover, shortly afterwards, Reza Shah Pahlavi saw the establishment of a national state in Iran as a clear confrontation with the traditional institution of religion, specifically in area of public education. His son Muhammad Reza Pahlavi attributed his credibility not to Islam and institution of religion, but to the pre-Islamic history of Iran, when he sought an alternative source for the legitimacy of his state. And this was undoubtedly an inescapable factor in the formation of the 1979 Islamic Revolution, when the component of religion this time entered the field of political and social relations of Iran in a perfect way. With the Islamic Revolution, religion became the focus of identity politics in Iran. The politics of the Islamic State at the beginning of the revolution were very clear in this regard, as the Constitution of the Islamic Republic has used the term Iranian Muslim people instead of Iranian nation or Iranian people in several cases. The idea of exporting the revolution, which was a common expression in Iranian political culture in the early 1980s, reflected the fact that the new state not only had relinquished its reliance on the so-called pre-Islamic culture of Iranian civilization, but also have a transnational image of its identity. This was also reflected in the curriculum of Iranian schools. In high school social science textbooks in Iran, nationalism had been described as a Western invention and a disease of Muslim societies that prevents Muslims from uniting. However, with the outbreak of the Iran-Iraq war, such a policy could not continue in full force. The invasion of Iran combined Islamic ideology with a sense of belonging to the homeland as a motherland. This fusion, of course, was alongside with the ambiguity of the exact relationship between religious ideology and the motherland. The victory was still with the Islamic approach. There is a famous slogan that was repeated in Iran during the war years: "The road to Quds passes through Karbala." Quds, the first Qibla of Muslims, and Karbala, the most important shrine of Shia Islam. But at the same time, the war was described as an invasion of the territory of all Iranians, both Muslim and non-Muslims. Moreover, many Iranian rituals, such as Nowruz or Yalda Nights, were fully accepted and extended. All in all, it can be said that as the emotional years of the beginning of the revolution passed, the requirements of state building moderated the initial extremism in denying the concept of nationality, but in a vague and confusing way. Whenever possible, territorial and cultural concepts of Iran were viewed through the lens of religious values, and in conflicting or seemingly conflicting points, the relationship between these concepts was silenced. After this relatively long introduction, in which I tried to provide a background for the specifics of the discussion of national identity in Iran, it's time to move on to the current research in a more direct way. In this study, I sought to examine the reflection of the image of Iranian nationality and national belonging in the Iranian educational system. To explain the importance of the education system in establishing national identity, it's enough to mention the name of Ernest Gellner. Gellner's description of the relationship between modernization and nationalism is mediated by a discussion of public education, where the government, by establishing and expanding a high standard culture, provides the basis for intellectual and cultural homogeneity within a national unit. Rereading the main moments of contemporary Iranian history confirms the correctness of Gellner's view on the relationship between state and education. David Menachery, a historian of contemporary Iran, puts this very issue at the center of his account of the history of modern education in Iran. That is, the state's recourse to education as the driving force behind the spread of modern thought in a society that needed to change. Now we have come into Iranian schools to see the reflection of the image of nationality and national identity and the pedagogy of these schools. We want to know how successful the religion, and specifically Iranian Shiism, has been in creating an image of nationality throughout its educational system. What does this image of nationality look like? To what extent do the basic components of civility and citizenship fit into this picture? And more precisely, what are the civic virtues inherent in Iranian religious education, and to what extent are they comparable to ideals of active citizenship? Finally, we hope that these questions can provide guidance for us on the issue of social cohesion in Iran. To answer these questions, I have used method of qualitative research to draw the national implications hidden in religious pedagogy in Iran. For this purpose, data collection was done through two techniques of the student focus group and interview with educational teachers in schools. Two groups of participants were used, both for teachers and students. First, I went to teachers and students who were working or studying in religious schools, and then the same sample size was applied to normal schools. In this way, I have sought to gain a deeper understanding of the experience of religion education in Iran by comparing the two groups. Let's not forget that our reference to the students was because we intended to examine the output of the educational process, and our reference to the teachers was in order to increase the credibility of attributing these results to the religious education process. So in the same way, we go to the results and findings of the research. First, an analysis of national belonging and the concept of nationality. Prior to the comparison and analysis of the findings, it was noteworthy that for both groups, the question of their views on nationality was a new and unthinkable question. Some students told me at the end of the session that this was the first time they had asked themselves what their relationship to their Iranian identity really was. In both groups, the answers at the beginning of the session were hesitant, cliched, and impersonal. As the conversation between the students continued, the students' position also changed and became more personal. However, the comparison of the data obtained from the religious school students group and the normal school students group showed a significant difference between the two groups. Normal school students generally showed a lower sense of national belonging. In some cases, even these students expressed a sense of embarrassment about being Iranian. One student said, "I do not want to say that Iran is inherently bad, but if other countries find out that you are Iranian, they will not look at you well." This tendency to look at Iran from the perspective of non-Iranians was a recurring theme in the conversations of normal school students. However, when I asked the students if patriotism in general is a trait you admire, I saw another side of the story. Some students more and some less, but all acknowledged the virtue of patriotism. The students without having a clear definition of the nature of homeland or agreeing on the one definition, believed that indifference to the country was a reprehensible spirit. These findings become interesting when placed alongside statements made by religious school students. On the one hand, compared to normal schools, students in religious schools showed more respect and interest in Iran. They acknowledged that no one can say, "I do not love Iran." And when one of those present claimed that she had no interest in Iran, they diligently challenged her claim. However, The understanding of the concept of Iran for this group was more than anything through the lens of Shi'ism. Students of religious schools used terms such as Imam Zaman Shia house and country with a large Shia population to describe their feelings about Iran. One of the participants in the meeting asked the crowd, "Do you not feel proud if you are told that an Iranian has won the Nobel Prize?" After confirming the people present, he asked again, "What if you were told that the person was a Baha'i?" In response, the entire crowd laughed out loud. After the concept of Shi'ism, it was the concept of altruism that was mentioned by religious students. However, they considered this altruism to be less limited to Iran's national borders. Everyone should be as kind to other human beings as they can be. National borders are merely a matter of contract in this regard. If we go to the teachers, these findings become somewhat more significant. Normal school teachers, when describing Iran and formulating nationality, referred more than anything to the glorious culture and history of Iran. One of these teachers told me, "If we know what our country has gone through in the past, we will be proud of being Iranian despite all the problems." Normal school students, however, were not proud of this glorious past. The reason for this was not directly stated in the data I collected during the work, but my reference is to Mariam Soltanzade's doctoral dissertation on history education and national identity in Iran. She quotes that one of the students asked her in an interview why she should be proud of Iran's past when there is nothing left of it now. Teachers of religious schools, on the other hand, pointed to several areas of understanding of the concept of nationality and national identity: place of birth, common culture, common language and history, and religion. But what was common to all teachers was the understanding of nationality through the concept of altruism. In exactly the same style mentioned in student conversations, the three teachers pointed out that patriotism is a level of altruism that can begin with the family, the neighborhood, and the city, and even go beyond a national unit. Okay, let's turn to the second question. That is the question of civil responsibility and the duty that one feels towards society and one's country. In response to this question, normal school students often expressed their frustration that something effective could be done about Iran. One of them said that in this situation, if I could do something for myself, I would have done a great job. When I asked about their precise prospects for serving Iran, some of them stated that they would immigrate from Iran if possible. This feeling of despair was more intense for the girls, and this difference between girls and boys was more evident among religious students. Look at this. Most of the religious boys answered my question that their service to Iran is in the form of the job they will be taking on, and that they are trying to do their social duty by doing their job properly. While religious girls openly replied that they had no action or plan to do anything for Iran. The relevance of these views to the views of teachers was interesting. The teachers of the boys' religious schools considered the service of an individual to his community to do the right thing entrusted to him. If each of us, in quotation, if each of us does our job properly, the situation in society will improve. However, the teacher of the girls' religious school I interviewed considered that the main task of women in society was motherhood and raising children. In the limited time remaining, I have to make a brief, quick, and of course, cautious summary of the findings. Three general points can be mentioned in this regard. Let's first turn to the challenge of national identity, its establishment and formulation. We first address the issue that the Islamic State in Iran seeks to build national identity on the basis of religion. It can be said that this effort, at least in practice, has not been successful. The Islamic Republic has sought to integrate the linguistic, cultural, and ethnic elements of the people of Iran under the general axis of religion to create national unity. However, as far as the data of this study show us, it can be argued that the practical result of this policy has been the general weakening of nationality among the various cultural sectors in Iran. On the one hand, non-religious groups engage in a sense of alienation, despair, and confusion toward Iran, while respecting the concept of patriotism. Religious ideology, on the other hand, has failed to provide a civic understanding of nationality by merging with other elements. The second article is about the feeling and civic virtue and social responsibility created in the Iranian educational system. Here, I want to point out the importance of the structural distribution of opportunities in the sense of belonging. As far as the findings allow, it can be argued that, in general, religious students had a clearer idea of their social responsibility than non-religious students. This is also true for boys compared to girls, but it seems that this can be attributed neither to the components of religion nor to the greater interest of men, because none of the religious students explained their social responsibility through religious concepts. Rather, they often referred to their job performance as their social responsibility, an issue that is directly related to the structural distribution of opportunities in a religious and patriarchal political structure. In other words, it can be concluded, albeit cautiously, from these findings that the level of participation, attachment, and belonging of citizens is directly related to the level of their social latitudes and opportunities. From here, I go to my last point, which is the complete lack of an active and participatory image of citizenship in the Iranian school curriculum. These were not the only students who, at best, saw their social responsibility as fulfilling their job responsibilities, which is a highly passive form of citizenship, but also teachers and educators in schools are completely unaware of the methods and approaches in the field of civic education and active citizenship. Their proposed topics for national education often fell into the paradigm of knowledge education rather than education aimed to strengthening citizenship skills or internalizing civic values. It seems that these results can at least reveal the need to further examine the status of national and civic affiliation in Iran to review educational policies. Thank you for your attention and patience. Thank you very much.
Thank you for another fascinating presentation. We now move on to Stacy. Stacy, do you need to share your screen?
I do, yes.
Okay. We'll wait a moment.
So I think our last presenter will need to unshare potentially.
Yes. Saeed Ali, do you know how to do that, to unshare your screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a little problem. Yes.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you've done it. And then let's see if, hold on.
In the meantime, I'll just remind everyone that you can submit your questions during the Q&A box, and we will entertain them during Q&A period.
I hope people can see and hear. Is that the case?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. I'm presenting today on the indigeneity and state violence, the case of the Baharna community in Bahrain. And I'm going to preface this by saying this is a sort of new arm of research for me, and this is very much a little pilot or a first sort of foray into trying to sort of capture a piece of an overall situation that may have something to do with this indigenous community. And so I have a couple of large research questions. Do the Baharna have a special plight in Bahrain's authoritarian state? And does their situation share characteristics with other indigenous struggles around the world? The second question I probably won't answer in this presentation, but it's sort of looming in my mind, and I wanted to sort of throw that out there. as part of the framing. And the first question, I may not answer either, actually, though I am trying to sort of get at it. There's a number of problems in trying to pick out the Baharna from other social groups and other identities and other political problems potentially. Who are the Baharna? The Baharna are the Sukan Asliyin, the original inhabitants. In the British colonial mind, these were Arabs without a pedigree, which is quite a disparaging way of looking at it, although that phrase continues to dog this group and comes up again and again, even on Twitter recently. And so we think of these as indigenous Arabs that are not in the Sunni tribal social structural system, so to speak, or that isn't their cultural background. How they come to be there on the islands in the archipelago, how long they've been there. We think, at least since the 7th century, if not earlier. Obviously, there's been continual habitation of the archipelago since Mesopotamian times. So really, we're going back into the opaque sort of early history. One of the major villages of Baharna communities is Bani Jamra. They claim Yemeni origin. Others might be descended from Northern Arabian folks. They are a Shia group, and they are distinct from other Shias, the Ajam, who are of Persian extraction. However, I should mention that there is a sense that the Ajam may also be indigenous in some way, having been there since great Iranian influence, 17th, 18th centuries or so. Sorry, that the word there, indignity, should be indigeneity. Apologies, I think I had a bad autocorrect there. I'm looking at the Baharna as the indigenous group, but the Ajan, if you think of it from the perspective of the late 18th century conquest by the Al Khalifa, who are Sunni tribal, they would be indigenous sort of to the current sort of hegemonic political and cultural power. So we're already pretty confounded in how we're looking at this, or how I'm looking at this. But we do know that Bahara have narratives, and particularly when you look at cultural production, music in the Dars, or you look at, which isn't my specialty, of course, or if you look at poetry, like Ali al-Jamri has done a wonderful job of translating Baharna poems that get to this sense of woundedness, which I can link to an affective turn in the overall sort of indigenous studies literature, which I don't have time to go into too much. I want to acknowledge on this slide Alice Shahabi. You may know her from her wonderful work on the edited volume, Bahrain's Uprising. I was in conversation with her in the development of a notion of applying indigeneity to the Baharna community in Bahrain. And so I just wanted to acknowledge her here in case I inadvertently absorbed. I don't want to take too much credit for this piece here. But a lot of what we see in the affective turn in indigenous studies is that we can point to the spaces that are indigenous in societies that are divided as oppositional place-based existences, that they are sort of from the point of view of the dominant frame, the eyesores, they represent the alternative narrative. They are a challenge to the very legitimacy of the state by their existence. They can illuminate the aspects of colonization and subsequent neoliberalism by way of predating them as a culture, predating them, and also acting in opposition to at many times, and also having native cultures and even native languages. In the case of the Baharna, it's a native dialect of Bahraini Arabic that is distinct in many ways, as Clive Hulls has shown in his work. And of course, there's traditional knowledge and ceremonial practices that are unique. And so as such, they're going to reject common discursive themes and so forth, and potentially link to other groups in the region. And so you could look at subjugated groups that claim indigeneity, Palestinians or Berbers. There might be some commonalities there. So what are we talking about in terms of the Baharna and some of the political aspects that are relevant to this community and social identity? We know that the Baharna were conquered by the Al Khalifa tribalists in the late 18th century. Their agricultural farms, so date cultivation, and even their participation in pearl diving and fishing were brought into a feudal system, so to speak, under Khalifa and allied tribal lordships. That this conquest and hierarchy set the stage, as I have argued, for sectarian identity. And so I should point out here that when we look at ethnicity and say the Baharna and the Ajam are distinct ethnicities, they form together most of the Shia in the country. And so we have what I would call an ethno-sectarian piece here that's hard to disentangle. But we do know in the lore that the British colonial records claim to bring out in terms of their listening to Baharna leaders, that there is this historical narrative that there were 300 Shia villages before the Al Khalifa conquest that were taken. A lot of the land around them was taken, obviously, by our conquerors here. And what I'm sort of picking out here is that it doesn't stop there. That gradually, as development of the country colonially and even after independence, for the purposes of global capital and the purposes of shoring up Al Khalifa legitimacy and sovereignty, these Baharna villages and also Ajam villages are gradually walled off and sort of created by ghettos. And when you see the infrastructural, for those who've spent time in Bahrain, the infrastructural development is really, really clear. These villages often have one or maybe just two entrances. They're encased. And as I pointed out in prior works, the Baharna in the 1920s, as they're being encased in these enclaves, they were also, in some cases, massacred by their overlords when they sought to seek rights to their economic production and also political rights. And so I have at the top of the screen here this trajectory, which is a little bit of a gloss, but this is a group that's been conquered, enslaved, massacred, and encased. And so I have at the bottom here some of the work that pulls this together. There's a growing body of work that's pulling this together. And so what this reminds me of from the world of sociology is Louis Quicquant's work on the United States, the connection between slavery, the ghetto, and prison. And I hate to shoehorn the United States experience into Bahrain. I'm just using this as a way of framing. But what Quicquant talks about is the use of class, race, and place suppression and stigmatization as a mode of neoliberal hegemony that controls labor and controls access to political rights through a punitive state arm. And so I'm basically moving that into as a jumping off point and saying, well, in Bahrain, we have a different sort of social structure, but it still follows when we look at the Baharna that we're starting from a point of slavery. Now in the United States, when we're talking about African-Americans, as Quicquant does, we're not talking about indigenous folks, so that's an added piece here when we apply it to Bahrain, but we can look at class, ethnicity, indigeneity, sect, and place in Bahrain and see a neoliberal regime being highly punitive towards this group. And so what Quicquant also does is say that that Baharna villages, for example, that are encased, well, I'm saying this, applying Quicquant, that we can talk about an ethno-racially stigmatized places. So I'm trying to bring the place in here, using Quicquant's motto that those places are prisons even before folks are disproportionately incarcerated in Joe Prison or a Hulk, which is certainly the case. And what we see from the Arab critical critical commentaries that are picked up in the media, we're starting to see notions of Baharna communities and Shia communities as open-air prisons. So this is starting to come to the fore in terms of local awareness. And so what I tried to do, again, just as a real preliminary pilot chunk, is to try to look at some data that actually maps some of the kinds of state violence that may be going on in the island. And so I'm looking at the ACLID data, the Armed Conflict and Events Location data. And so this is some mapping since the Arab Spring of where things are happening. It's not very helpful in terms of picking out social structural pieces that I'm looking at, but I think what you can see very quickly without a big analysis is that things are definitely happening in very distinct places in terms of conflict, so which suggests something anyway. And so the data that I'm looking at is a particular data set in a very distinct period of time, not necessarily certainly not the most violent time in Bahrain since the Arab Spring. We would look at earlier years, but I wanted a little bit more of the new normal, if you will. And so what this data does, and I have to mention, so I normally am a qualitative scholar, and it's really during the pandemic that I've sought to avail myself of some of my quantitative training, such as it is, and to try to get some new ways of looking at things when I can't be in the field. And so I've recognized that there are numerous caveats that I have to make when I even do this, look at something like indigeneity and apply a data set to it. I mean, even I'm a little appalled at myself at times, but I'm trying to sort of work through this maybe as one piece of a larger sort of critical framing. But this data collects information from media reports, human rights reports, and tries to sort of triangulate with multiple sources to get at dates, actors, locations, fatalities, and types of political violence, and also peaceful protests. Now, of course, there's a huge bias with media reports. We're not getting everyday crime or violence. And I would argue that part of what's going on in the Bahrain state is everyday criminal justice is actually being used as a weapon against either Shia, either Baharna, or oppositional figures. And so that's not really going to be picked up in a data set like this. So we're missing a ton of potential state violence events and issues. But what happened when I first was introduced to the ACLID data and just took a gander at it, in terms of the locations, I said to myself, these are all, not all, there's so many Baharna villages on this data set, and there's no coding for that. There's so many Shia spaces as well, if we're picking up on the Ajam, and there's no coding for that. So I actually went through and transformed the data in this time period into majority sect and majority ethnicity locations to see if I could pick out some of these structural patterns. So how I did that, there's no one list or something. So we know that the Bahrain state doesn't actually give us many helpful demographics in terms of sect or ethnicity. It basically just releases data that says, most people are Muslim, which hardly, in my opinion, gets at some of the structural problems and political problems. And so I've had to sort of go through the locations hand by hand, and then look for a credible source that says who lives there. Now, I have lived in Bahrain, and so I'll have to say that when I looked down this list, I knew from living there who was living in these things, because this is essentially, sorry to be a gloss, I'm not going to make a big argument, but this is an apartheid state, right? People are living in segregated spaces. So if you've been there, and certainly if you're from there, just by looking at this list, but that's not good enough from a scholarly point of view. And so I went back and tried to find sources, some historical, some current, and tried to triangulate and come up with some sense of what these places were demographically. Now, our baseline in terms of estimated demographics in the whole country, I have here on the bottom. According to ADHRB, Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain are about 45% of the total population. And then according to, again, these are just estimates because the government doesn't release, but we're looking at probably 30%, when we triangulate a lot of different human rights and other scholarly sort of estimates, we get Sunni at 30% and then the Shia at 65%. So 45% Baharna who are a part of this 65% Shia number. Okay, so I tried to, I was thinking I was going to have to use some really fancy inferential statistics to show that something was happening in Baharna spaces, but actually the relationships were so strong, which makes sense because I saw it just in eyeing the data. So I guess I did a lot of work and a lot of rigor just to show something that is completely obvious. So apologies there, but you know, sometimes you need to have certain empirical rigor put in place in things that people sort of seem to already know or seems to be the case, particularly if you're a critical scholar. So in this frame, there were 62 locations with some kind of reported event, okay? My new variables were ethnicity, which I coded as Arab tribal, Baharna, Ajam, Baharna and Ajam, when I was getting conflicting sources saying that it was, you know, both. Obviously there's intermarriage and a lot of this stuff. I mean, this is just a real quick and dirty way of doing this, in all honesty. And then mixed areas would be places where there are a significant amount of expats living, where you just simply can't determine what the demography might really be at that point. And then I also had a variable for the sect, Shia Sunni, and mixed would include people, not just Muslims, but people who are Christian or Hindu, which are 2-3% of people potentially. 61.3% of the locations that had events were Baharna. And then if you added in Ajam, you had 87.4% of those locations, and you can see that here. Okay, the events are interesting. This data set had 1,800 or so events. It's important to point out that they were mostly peaceful protests. We had one event with a fatality, but what I did was I transformed the event types into a binary of violence reported or nonviolent. And so I first sort of looked at this. I'm interested obviously in state violence. And so they do have information on actors. And I should report that there was really no pattern to be determined as to whether actor one, if you know the data, the sort of, I don't want to say instigator, but the sort of primary actor in the event, according to ACLED, when that was the state, which happened in about 60 events, there was no correlation between it being a Baharna or Shia space in terms of the event happening. But when you transform the events into violent and non-violent, you begin to see something really interesting. And so here we have what I am considering violent from the data. These are the categories. So arrest, attacks, weapons, disruption by the state, excessive force against protesters, looting, mob violence, protests that include intervention by authorities, sexual violence and violent demonstration. And then others were peaceful protests, change to group activities. ACLED uses this if there's any sort of reporting that the internal dynamics of an opposition group or a criminal group have changed, or their allegiances have changed, or their MO has changed. So this is not a violent thing necessarily. And then there was a category for other. And what you see here in this.
Stacey, sorry to interrupt, but can we
I'm over
wrap
time,
up, please?
Yeah, I can end here in about a minute.
So just feel free to conclude, that's all.
Oh yeah, okay. So the proportion of events that are violent in Baharna spaces, and I can't see it because, sorry, I can't see my own slide because I can't move the speakers that are, anyway, it doesn't matter. So here we have that all violent events and all non-violent events, you see a difference in the proportion of overall events when we're in the Baharna communities. Okay, so potentially the Baharna community's prevalence in this data set is a bias in the sample. Obviously there's a political problem here, and that's what this sample is going to get at. We also don't know the connection between what we think is the demography of the population and the community identity. That's an ecological fallacy if you're a methodologist. And so that's confounding all of this. But what this suggests that the political events of whatever type are disproportionately happening in Bahar villages. But then when we look at when they turn violent, then that's where we really see the difference. So what happens here, if there's no difference between violence and nonviolence in these spaces, we would not see a disparity when we do that, when we separate it out between all violent and all nonviolent events. And so given the size of the sample, this is incredibly statistically significant without, really running anything. Because of the sample size. And so I was going to talk a little bit about a specific event, the fatality event that is really interested in sort of qualitatively framing what we're talking about here, but I'm going to save that. People can contact me if they're interested and or in the Q&A. Thank you so much, I appreciate it. And again, this is very preliminary, and so I'm looking forward to a lot of criticisms potentially in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Stacy.
I will stop sharing.
Next, we have Miri. Miri, do you need to share your screen?
Yes, and I'm going to do that now. So thank you everyone for being here. And I also really want to thank the organizers for making a space to actually talk about citizenship and sectarianism on the Middle East. I'm a sociologist, which has entirely neglected the Middle East and its diasporas. So I especially appreciate spaces like this. So today I'm going to talk about Coptic citizenship as counter-narrative in diasporic human rights advocacy. This is part of my dissertation research, and I'll talk a bit more about that. But the US has often had a problem in its foreign policy between its balancing its security interests with its values and human rights, especially in the age of counterterrorism, where we see so many terrorism laws are used to suppress mobilization and human rights advocacy and activism. And this is both abroad and in the US as well. And Egypt in particular poses a special problem because it's both been a long-term security ally, and also administration after administration has had a difficult time dealing with Egypt's undemocratic tendencies, authoritarian tendencies, or authoritarianism, and violations of human rights. And I argue that religious minorities are often at the heart of these debates. And so many of these debates also unfold over or are battled over religious minorities, primarily because they're seen as the quintessential victims of terrorism and security concerns, but also any advocacy around them around religious freedom is seen as an attempt to move towards better human rights. So we've seen this play out over the past few years. So under the Trump administration, he called Egyptian President Sisi his favorite dictator, all while praising him for advancing religious freedom. So when President Sisi built the largest cathedral in the Middle East and became the first president to attend Christmas Mass, Pompeo attended this and said that it was a symbol of hope. And Trump, of course, tweeted that Sisi's moving the country towards a more inclusive future. So we see here how religious freedom efforts are often used to kind of suppress or turn away or distract from human rights violations. So when Biden ran for president, he sought to undo kind of the damage that Trump did by centering human rights and democracy in his foreign policy. And here he tweeted that there were no more blank checks for Trump's favorite dictator. And this was seen as a promise that Biden did for advocates in Egypt and abroad, that he was going to finally start holding authoritarian regimes accountable. So between this kind of dilemma between security or democracy, which I think is battled over religious freedom or human rights, we see these kind of two images of Sisi emerging. Is Sisi the savior of Copts and the protector of religious freedom, or is he the authoritarian oppressor and the violator of human rights? And of course, this dilemma is not just unique to Egypt, but we see this across the UAE, Syria, and Bahrain, who all use religious freedom as soft power to distract or cover up for other human rights violations. And they all also use religious freedom as soft power in like slightly different ways as well. So against this backdrop of a transnational battle between security and democracy and religious freedom and human rights, I'm interested in how advocates, diasporic advocates, or advocates in the US frame the Coptic question to influence US foreign policy. And the primary people who or the primary groups that have spoken or represented the Coptic question in DC are three groups: Coptic lobby groups who've been organizing since the 70s, international religious freedom advocates who are mostly conservative and mostly focus narrowly on religious minorities. And this also made up a lot of the Trump support during his presidency. And then the last group is human rights advocates and democracy advocates. And that's my focus for this presentation, though the dissertation deals with all three. And the last group is mostly made up of recently exiled Egyptians, Egyptian Americans who've been mobilizing in part of these organizations and networks of advocacy for a while now, as well as non-Egyptians, mostly white Americans who are invested in democracy in the Middle East. So the literature, which I think mimics what happens, often separates national movements from minority activism. So minority activists are often studied as a group in isolation, making claims on their own, while national movements or exiled activism, especially post-2011, especially in the case of Egypt post-2014, there's been so much literature on exiled activists that end up just completely ignoring the place of completely ignoring the role of religious minorities, but also ignore the place of minority concerns in their activism. So these groups are seen, or these movements are seen as completely separate, but I'm interested in precisely how do they overlap, and specifically how do national movements or Egyptian activists or exiled activists frame minority concerns amidst broader claims that they're trying to make. And I did this by doing an ethnography in Washington, DC amongst foreign policy advocacy between March 2019 until March 2020 in person, and then afterwards in online after COVID hit. And of course, this was in DC. So one of the discursive strategies that activists use is framing Copts as citizens. And there's a long history and there's a long debate amongst in Egypt and the diaspora around how do you classify Copts necessarily. So many Copts have used this language of minority rights because it has appealed to an international audience and has allowed them to make claims beyond the nation and attract attention beyond the nation. And this has also been critiqued by other Copts who see this as an attempt to mobilize international foreign intervention, that it ends up kind of siloing Copts into minority concerns, whereas Copts are seen as the original inhabitants or central to the national fabric. So this has been an ongoing debate. And activism, both in Egypt and abroad, has also used citizenship, religious freedom, human rights, which all to kind of mobilize and frame Coptic movements or Coptic concerns. And important, I think, is that all of these offer very different trajectories for what is the problem, who is the perpetrator, how do we even understand Copts and their belonging in the nation. So against this backdrop or this long debate, one thing that advocates do is frame Copts as citizens. So I asked an advocate I was talking to an advocate in an interview, and I was asking her, what does the Coptic question mean to her? And she said, I see the Coptic dilemma, which is, are Copts unique, or are the Copts Egyptians? Are Copts Copts, or are Copts Egyptians? I mean, I think my view on that is pretty obvious, which is that Copts are Egyptian citizens. Ultimately, they're living in the same country, right? There are specificities, but Coptic issues are citizen issues. And I asked where she tracks that kind of thought from. I think a lot of it was after the Arab Spring, right? And just seeing that there was a call for more universal values and this whole idea of Copts and Muslims coming together and da-da-da-da. Which some of that I think is obviously romantic, very romanticized, but some of it I think is powerful in that this was a moment of awareness of how authoritarianism and corruption and tyranny affects everybody. So in framing Copts as citizens, the problem, or the primary problem, then becomes a question of authoritarian regimes or authoritarianism that impacts all citizens, including minorities. And she continues, it's looking at these much larger issues that affect Egyptian society and understanding how the Coptic community or how the Christian community is impacted. Incarceration, how does that impact Copts? Economic crisis. I find that there's often this trap of these are Coptic issues, so we're looking at these as Coptic issues rather than they're huge societal issues. They're systemic issues that impact Copts. So by defining, again, Copts as citizens, what advocates end up doing is looking at focusing on their major concerns. So in this era, post-2014, prisons and incarceration has been a primary focus, as well as the economic crisis. And so looking at these broader national concerns and trying to understand how do they specifically impact Copts. So when Coptic activist Rami Kamel was arrested in November 2019, it was a few days before he was leaving to attend the UN Minority Rights Forum. And he was arrested as part of a huge wave of mass arrests at a time in which there were many protests, or kind of rare protests that emerged in Egypt. And when Rami was arrested, he was charged with funding and belonging to a terrorist organization, disturbing public order, and spreading false information. And it's important to note that the emergence of prisons and incarceration as the primary goal or focus of many of these advocates is relatively new, given that prior to 2013 or prior to Sisi's presidency, the problem of prisons or mass incarceration was seen as a problem that was unique to the Brotherhood. This was one of many ways that regimes over successive years have tried to demolish the Brotherhood. But only after 2013 and 2014 did the regime start attacking civil society, and it increasingly became a concern of human rights activists, especially that these activists were not only kind of making broader claims, but these were their own friends and their own selves and their own families that they were mobilizing around. So it became an intimate personal problem for many of these activists who are claims makers. So against this backdrop, there was a sense that while the Brotherhood were targeted through prisons and the civil society was targeted through prisons, that Copts were generally protected from this mechanism of attack or mechanism of targeting, because the regime had so often said that they are protecting and saving Copts. So against this backdrop, Rami's arrest came as a political opportunity because it really shocked everyone when a Christian was arrested. And this became an opportunity for many to start pushing even further this narrative on Coptic citizenship. So I asked another advocate about the significance of his arrest, and she said, it's not just the arrest of an individual. It's the arrest of someone who is, first of all, a Christian, who's a minority that the government is alleging that it's protecting. So that's one thing. It's also the arrest of someone who has been instrumental for documenting and reporting on the Christian community and violations based on that community. Arresting that individual makes it so that there's less reporting, less documentation, and less awareness about what's going on and the challenges facing the Christian community. And despite prisons not being a primary topic in Coptic, and a primary problem that's seen as a Coptic problem, it became a political opportunity for advocates to kind of hone in on Christians as victims of the state. And in another example, I was talking to an advocate whose organization focuses on political incarceration in Egypt, or political prisoners in Egypt. And he had a case of a boy who was recently arrested, whose mother was Christian and whose father was Muslim. So by all intents and purposes, legally, this boy is Muslim because he takes over his father's religion. So in an interview with him, he was talking about how he wanted to frame this as a case of a religious minorities case. And he says, I think if it's framed as a religious minorities case, it would get more coverage. And I asked why? Because there are less religious minorities cases, right? So you're not fighting for space with 60,000 other people. That's one thing. The other thing is that because there's a larger history of Coptic advocacy and a Coptic diaspora, a narrative of Coptic persecution, that is very legitimate. It taps into something where you can mobilize Republicans around, right? Because these are like the Republicans' perfect victims, so to say. And so Copts were used as a strategy for advocates to kind of, as an entryway or an entry point for advocates to start mobilizing in a bipartisan manner in Congress. Yeah, so they were leveraged in Congress to kind of make new relationships or tap into relationships that they had otherwise been unable to make an indent in. And another advocate also says this. I mean, in some ways it gives a foothold because the Trump administration has made Christian issues so important, right? I mean, it's both trying to use this pretension to care about Christians as a way to draw awareness about what's going on, about the fact that, yeah, Christians are still vulnerable in Egypt, and also using that as a way to talk about why things are bad for everybody in Egypt. And this was a particularly important strategy under the Trump administration, which again was focusing so much on religious freedom. So yeah, so it was a particularly useful strategy under the Trump administration to talk about religious minorities as an entryway to talk about all citizen problems. So to kind of wrap up, and in truth, this is about halfway through a chapter that I'm like now slightly stuck on, and I was hoping, you know, contrary to conference norms, which is to ask questions, but I also welcome comments. But in a sense, I'm thinking about what are the implications of this. So we see how it is in some ways an effective strategy as a, not an effective strategy, but as a strategy to enter bipartisan conversations, especially with Congress people who are otherwise perhaps unsympathetic to the cause of prisons, which is historically seen as a brotherhood problem. And whether it's actually effective is I think a different question, but it's also one that's used by Democrats to push back against Republicans who have focused narrowly on religious minorities. And at the same time, in thinking about the implications for it, I'm thinking about what does it mean to, so if by framing Coptic citizenship as a problem that's narrowly concerned with authoritarian regimes or just the government, what does that mean when, for example, political prisoner, one of a handful of popular prisoners, becomes the face of Coptic concerns? And what does it mean to ignore other minority concerns, like the unique concerns amongst minorities that has historically shaped or defined their mobilization? And yeah, so what does it mean to ignore other issues? And what does it mean also to only focus on Copts, or to primarily focus on Copts when it's strategic? Or, as an advocate himself told me, minority concerns are only just that, they're just minority concerns, meaning that, meaning that minority concerns aren't as important as other issues. So they're only leveraged or primarily leveraged when it's strategic. And then I I don't think I'm clear, but I hope something is coming across. But the other line of thinking that I'm a little bit stuck on is also thinking about when we're thinking about citizenship and we're thinking about primarily the state as the perpetrator and what is responsible for violations and discrimination, like what do we do with other forms of or other types of perpetrators, or what do we do with intercommunal or interpersonal discrimination? And in my conversations with any advocates, this often leads into a debate around, well, what do we start with, the law or the people? Which I think is a roundabout conversation. And this also, and I'll end with this example that has, I think, haunted me in some ways, but I was in a closed meeting with advocates to talk about Egyptian advocacy abroad. And this meeting had invited civil human rights activists and many members who were formerly either affiliated with the Brotherhood or Brotherhood sympathetic, etc. And then there was me, who was brought on as a Coptic representative. And the entire conversation revolved around the relationships between the Muslim Brotherhood violations and violations against the Brotherhood and violations against human rights activists. And in the end, I just kind of brought up the importance of making sure that we're, bringing in minority voices, so to say, and bringing in minority activists, and thinking about the limits of looking only at authoritarian regimes as the beginning and end of this kind of activism. In which one of the members, who's a former Brotherhood affiliated, kind of like looked up in the air and thought a little bit, and he was like, yeah, you're right. Like we should start thinking about LGBTQ concerns, because like us, they've also been attacked by the Brotherhood, by the state. And I think there's a lot that the Brotherhood could do to be more inclusive of LGBTQ concerns. And I think that just kind of left me thinking about this idea that in framing Coptic citizenship, and we're just looking at authoritarian governments, like where do other kinds of perpetrators fall, or how do they get held accountable, or what do we leave out in this kind of narrative? And more importantly, also in the end, is what kind of solidarities this even allows, or the limits of solidarities in the wake of authoritarian regime, or in mobilizing against authoritarian regimes. But I'll end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Miri. Thank you, everyone, for fascinating presentations. Maybe this panel should have been titled, The Limits of Solidarity and Nationalism, because that seems to be a common pattern, whether in Iran, in Israel, in Bahrain, Egypt, and so on and so forth. So we can begin with questions. There's already one that has been presented. It's for Smadar. If the Ashkenazi Jews who suffer from a sense of alienation in Israel due to promoting elitist Ashkenazi Hebrews instead of their original language, Yiddish, for obvious reasons, of course, if they stand in solidarity with the Mizrahi or even other ethnicities, and then generally on any way of finding sources of solidarity. This is what this person would like to know. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Do you hear me? Is the voice okay?
Yes.
Well, Ashkenazim own Israel, so I don't think that people of color ought to present solidarity for them. As far as Yiddish is part of their colonial effort, let me quote author Anton Shamas, who said that Hebrew was the best success of the Zionist operation. Ashkenazim completely erased their Yiddish as the language of the diaspora and made it very shameful to talk Yiddish. And they kind of like reinvented and expanded Hebrew from a limited biblical language to a language of the everyday. By the same kind of mode, they forced Mizrahim to unlearn their Arabic. It's just that we didn't do it willingly, but Arabic marked us as the enemy. So it was a low-class mark and it was an enemy mark. So nowadays, when Ashkenazim feel like a minority and the white privilege is being threatened, they have a renaissance of studying Yiddish as a minoritized language because the younger generation feels sorry for the loss of the language. However, it doesn't make them give up their privilege. And even Ashkenazi feminists who are sensitive to Mizrahi issues said, unless someone forces me, I'm not going to give up my space and my privilege. This forcing will not happen because the moment Israel admits legally in court that Jews are not equal, and underneath this facade of the Jewish state, there is a racial order, the question would be asked, okay, you colonized Palestine to have a homeland for the Jews. All Jews are supposed to be equal. Now you're going to tell us that some Jews are white but not quite, and they are the majority, but they have no majority rights, and then it is ruled by a European minority. So usually cases of intra-Jewish racial discrimination don't end up with a verdict, because the verdict will be an admission that the foundation of the Jewish state is a racial order.
Thank you for answering that question. If there are any other questions from the audience, please feel free to type them into the Q&A box. In the meantime, I'm thinking about the ghettoization and the classism that's involved within these different types of discrimination against minoritized people. So there may not necessarily be minorities, but they're being minoritized, for example, in the context of Bahrain. What more can we learn about this in the context of your own research about the ghettoization and the classification of these minoritized people, through limitation of opportunities in the job market and any other aspects of life?
I can start answering that from the from the perspective of my research. Absolutely, and I think this is where the Kantian piece application would be strengthened. Absolutely, that the job opportunities are much less. When I was working on my dissertation several years ago before the Arab Spring, I heard many times that Shia Bahrainis, which include Baharna, right, were not hireable. There was definitely employment discrimination. In particular, for various reasons, I got to know 2 hotel owners who simply wouldn't hire from that group flat out. So I mean, that's a little bit anecdotal because I don't study labor and particularly, but discursively and just in being in this space, absolutely the job opportunities are more limited. At that time, I was doing an ethnography of women's police stations. And I can tell you from that perspective, when Ajam came in with able to speak Arabic, but Persian may be their first mother tongue, they would have an accent. And there was numerous sort of jokes that were made in the police station about the person's poor use of Arabic that they were making with me. And my use of Arabic was similarly problematic, accented, and often grammatically unsound myself. And so I thought it was really funny that I got brought into this discriminatory linguistic piece in it. So you can sense it in all these ways, which is going to further encase people, right? They don't have the sort of cultural cachet, if you will, when they speak or where they're from, in order to avail themselves of, the better jobs, the white collar jobs, and so forth. Blue collar jobs, there's a lot of opportunities. So in oil refining, you'll see a lot of Baharna folks. So, it's not completely closed, but it's certainly not the upward mobility that you would hope for if all things being equal. So yeah, I think that's a really important piece to how the Baharna are minoritized. Thank you for that.
Anyone else would like to talk about that part of the research, or maybe that aspect that you may want to study in the future? If not, I want to ask Sayed Ali a question about Baha'is in Iran and how they are being minoritized and how they are excluded from the conversation on citizenship. You mentioned in your presentation that when they were mentioned, there was a response of laughter, and I would like to learn more about that, please.
Thank you very much. Sorry, maybe my video has a problem. Yes, Baha'is in Iran, from the beginning of their expansion in Iran has many identical problems and many problems in for example, having rights. For example, in constitutional revolution, we have many claims that this from ulama, from Shia clergies, that the constitutional revolution is not a good movement because it's supported by Baha'is, and this is about the past. And for today's about today, Baha'i, the religion of Baha'i can examine from many aspects. For example, a Baha'i person cannot be freely explain his or her religious if he or she want to be a student in university or a student in a school or any other formal positions in Iran, because Baha'i religion has not been considered as a religion, as a formal religion, an accepted religion in Iran. And there is a long, I can say, contradictions between Shia and Baha'i in the context of Iran, because exactly Baha'is have claimed about the last Imam of Shias, and this is the context of these forces on Baha'is. I hope that I could explain what you asked.
There's a question for you from Aziz, who asks, he asks about pedagogy. He wants to know how critical thinking has been interpreted and discussed within the educational system. There's a rich intellectual history in Iran, but he wonders how it is curtailed in some spaces.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes, no problem. So he's asking how critical thinking has been interpreted and discussed in the educational system. Since there's a rich intellectual history in Iran, he's asking how that is being limited in some spaces.
Thank you. I understand the question. Critical education. I want to answer this question from the perspective of the policy of education, and I want to say that the actual policy that is shaping in the school context not necessarily refer to and depend on the intellectual context of the country, but it is also related to some other factors like the structure of political decision, the structure of administration of educational systems. In Iran, we have an centralized administration of education for contents, for anything that is related for education, and education is one of the most focused points of centralized state. For this reason, the context of intellectuals in Iran couldn't be easily enter the content of schools and content of school curriculums, because the structure of decision making about school context and textbooks are very centralized in a very specific into very specific councils and structures.
Thank you for that. There was a comment in the chat that Noura Lori shared, and she says, fascinating papers and presentations. She loves how all of you call attention to racial hierarchies in various ways without, oops, where did it go? Without connecting everything to the US, basically. And race relations in the US, applying the US experience, but carefully construct how, I'm having trouble scrolling, how classifications of belonging are connected to power. And I know, Smadar, you wanted to reply to this.
Am I listened to, the voice? Okay. I think Nora is raising here a very important point, which is the way that because of the hierarchies of power within academia, particularly getting into the tier 1 journals, oftentimes scholars tend to superimpose US, UK models for writing and for theoretization of their data. And throughout my career, it's been one of my fights to engage my community's intellectuals as equal. That is that, say, Dr. Aaron Itzhaki for me is as important as Foucault, even more. But if I quote Itzhaki in my bibliography list of the journal, and I will not quote Foucault, that's not going to go well. And I think that all of us need to be very much attuned to have horizontal dialogue with the intellectuals of the communities that we study and cherish them as much as, or even more than, Ernest Gellner. Because in that way, we can undo the hierarchy of citation and engage with people in our community, not only as what we call in anthropology, the drumming and dancing informants that are there to advance our career, but also as colleagues. And it's very easy to put everything on the racial paradigm coming from the US. There is a very large body of literature of feminists of color, for example, and the black-white axis is very tempting. But racial hierarchies in the Arab world or in the Muslim world are way more sophisticated, and crossing boundaries between races is also way more delicate. And if we just go to uncontextualized intersectionality model and so forth, I think we are missing the boat. And let me finish with an example. The first anthropologist to talk about connectivity in family dynamics was Suad Joseph. Her material came from Palestinian refugee camps outside Beirut. The very important pieces that she published kind of went into oblivion until connectivity became a feminist of color issue here, mainly Black feminist color. And then while we are required to quote Black feminists, with all due respect to their important work, they do not quote Suad Joseph, who wrote about connectivity about 20 years before.
Thank you for that. We've run out of time. If there are any further questions, maybe we might squeeze in one last question, but if not, maybe it would be good to end on this note and encourage everyone to cite more women and cite more people of the global majority. Diverse bibliographies are the best. All right, thank you very much. We have 15 minutes before the next panel. So if there are no more questions, or if you have your own, please feel free to directly contact our panelists. Thank you very much for very engaging and very enlightening presentations.